Okay, so the next one we're going to look at is light levels. Most plants require a set amount of light, and they are adapted to those conditions. So you have some that are shade adapted and others that are high intensity light adapted. And this helps them avoid competition or outcompete other species. And this is because light is vital for photosynthesis. And they have a pigment called chlorophyll that is absorbs blue and red light. Green light is typically passes through or reflected. And this means that where we have a dense forest canopy, most of the light that is actually getting through to the ground is going to be the green light, because that's not being absorbed above the surface. So we have this shade. What light does get through is going to be of more the green wavelength, because the blue and the red are being absorbed by the chlorophyll. And this explains why we can see leaves as green. Plants that live beneath the forest canopy will have additional compounds to act as pigments to help them use the light that is getting through. So this additional pigment is called anthocyanins and carotenoids. So let's write those in and make sure I spell them right. Anthocyanins and carotenoids. And these are pigments that absorb green light, so that they can photosynthesize in this relatively stressful environment where there is not much light, and what is the green variety. These also have a use in plants that live in bright sunlight, because they protect against damage from UV light, wave radiation, and high light levels. So they fulfill two roles. Some examples for that then would be something like bluebells, ivy. They are plants that have this adaptation. Next one then is pH. So pH is the measure of H+ ions in a solution. Many plants can't survive in acidic soils, so that's a low pH. In part because there's not very much nitrogen fixing bacteria. So soils with low pH have few nitrogen fixing bacteria, and nitrogen is a vital nutrient for making proteins and chlorophyll and those sort of things. So this is a stressful environment. And plants that are adapted to cope with this environment are able to outcompete plants that are more vigorous, because they won't be overshadowed So because it's stressful environment, small plants will not be overshadowed. So the example for this one is our ever helpful sundew, which is this tiny plant with these sort of paddle-shaped leaves, which grow in acidic soils. So there's lots of H plus ions. There isn't any NO3s. There's no nitrates because there's no nitrogen-fixed bacteria. And we have all these sticky hairs on our sundew. And these sticky hairs allow it to substitute inorganic nitrates from the soil by capturing insects. So the insects can get stuck to it. The sundew will digest its prey, and that will provide it with the nitrogen compounds it needs to grow. So this is a way that it can overcome this problem. In addition, in water that is polluted with acidic mine waste, for example, so acid mine drainage in a river, we have our spoil heaps that seep acid-rich waters into our river. So this has got a low pH. Some of the impacts from this might be something like damage to calcium-based exoskeletons. So things like water snails or coccolithophores, which are a type of phytoplankton, have calcium-based exoskeletons, and the low pH, the H plus ions, will cause damage to those. And it can also damage things like gills, root hairs. The proteins become denatured by the low pH. And we can solve that by adding something like crushed limestone to neutralize the acidic waters. Next one then, mineral nutrients. So plants are adapted to grow in nutrient poor soils. They might have a symbiotic relationship with nitrogen fixing bacteria. So this would be things like legumes, which are peas, or trifolates like clovers. And they can then outcompete more vigorous plants because they're not outshadowed. So we can change this abiotic factor by doing things like scraping off topsoil, or we can look at doing it for things like avoiding the application of fertilizer. So these are sort of things that you might see in hay meadows or heathlands. And we have some species that are adapted to that. So for hay meadows, you have harebells or common eyebright, heathlands, things like gorse. And heathers. Oh, and an example of the sort of clovers, legumes would be vetches in a hay meadow, and clovers, things like bird's foot trefoil. And the last one then is salinity. So the sea is very salty, as in very saline. Rivers are going to be freshwater. And halfway between the two, we have brackish water. So this is slightly salty and slightly fresh, so it's not as salty as the seawater. Things like the opossum shrimp. Is a very productive, reproduces very quickly, and it will grow really nicely in brackish waters, so the intertidal sort of mudflats and lagoons. Is where it's very well found, or there's a lot of it, and you have certain waders and bird species which are adapted to consume them. So things like the pied avocet, which you find overwintering in the estuary, and they are adapted because they have this upturned beak that they can skim along the surface of the water, just under the surface of water, grabbing these opossum shrimp and eating them. Or you have the dunlin, which literally walks along and sort of picks them off one by one from just under the surface. So you might need to manage a wetland to increase the amount of brackish standing water for these opossum shrimps to feed our waders.